Today I'll be discussing research I'm currently undertaking to study the evolution of disability-specific programming and administrative work in the 19-campus City University of New York system. My aim in my aim in this study is to use oral history and archival analysis to reconstruct the history of disability access programming, going back as far as the mid-1970s, when the first Pre-Rehabilitation Act programs began. By paying close attention to the programs developed in the name of disability access throughout CUNY's history, I hope to track the ways institutional beliefs about disability as a concept or disabled students as a population may differ across different time periods and institutional contexts. I hope understanding this history will help administrators, including writing program administrators, better understand the forces at play when we confront our institutions on issues of disability. Since I'm still very much in the midst of my research process, my aims for today's talk are fairly modest. I'll begin by discussing my own stake in the panel's theme, discussing what makes my project a disability studies research project as opposed to simply a study about disability. I will then outline my methodology and present a few of my early findings that are beginning to shake loose from the data. So, what do I mean by describing my approach as a disability studies methodology? As my co-panelist, Margaret Price, has observed in her essay, Disability Studies Methodology, Explaining Ourselves to Ourselves, there is no singular, monolithic approach that characterizes disability studies. As an interdisciplinary field, we draw together a wide range of methods and discourses. What unites disability research, then, is a stance toward the concept of disability itself. Rather than seeing disability as a purely medical phenomenon, we in disability studies investigate the social and cultural factors that affect the lives of disabled people. For those of us who research within institutions of higher education, one direction this stance leads is to investigate the lived experience of disabled students and faculty, and therefore to better show the ways normalized academic practices and beliefs impose barriers to full access. In this way, we see factors like curriculum design, technological tools, teaching practices, hiring promotion procedures, time to degree scheme, even admissions policies, how all of these features built into the fabric of our colleges and universities contribute to how accessible or inaccessible these institutions really are. One central aim, I hope, of disability studies research in higher education is to find ways to make our institutions more accessible to more people, to find better approaches to promoting access than the ones we tried in the past. My aim in this study is to track back in the historical record to the first programs designed to serve disabled students within CUNY, the nation's largest public urban university system, and to unpack the beliefs about disability and academic life central to those early efforts. By comparing these early programs to later ones, I hope to track what's changed within the institution's stance toward disability, particularly as the field of disability services in higher education has gained professional ascendancy and as accommodation practices have become more standardized. The main bulk of my data for this study comes from interviews with 15 to 20 disability service providers from around the CUNY system. I'm speaking to providers from all three kinds of CUNY campuses, 2-year, 4-year, and graduate campuses. I divide my informants into 3 generational groups. The first generation began working in the CUNY system in the 1970s, either before or soon after the passage of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which actually came into force in 1978. A few members of this generation are still working in the system, but most of them are now retired. I'm identifying the second generation by their proximity to the passage of the ADA in 1990, so folks who started in the late 80s and early 90s. The third, post-ADA, post-Section 504 generation, began their work in the last 10 to 15 years, including some who began their work only this year. My interview process has 2 main stages, individual interviews and focus groups. I'm using the initial interviews to discover the scope of the history my informants know, but also to draw out potential topics for the focus groups later on. My interviews, which last approximately 60 minutes, break into 5 groups of questions. The first group focuses on the subject's professional history, when and where they started their job, their previous professional training, and what had been their major achievements as a program director. So, sort of their personal history in the job. This category provides me with the most useful historical coverage to fill in my timeline. It also helps me represent the wide diversity of professional fields my subjects come from, including common fields like social work or clinical psychology, but also academic fields like sociology and comparative literature. My second, I ask my informants to describe their perspective on what exactly the work of disability service directors is, what they see as the necessary skills for a director, what are the major hurdles that they face, and whether they see the role that they play on campus as primarily administrative or primarily activist. This final question provided especially interesting differences among my informants, which I'll discuss more in a moment. My third group asks my informants how they see the role of disability service provider working within their local institution. So here it becomes particular to the campus. Here I ask how they negotiate campus politics and relations with other branches of the administration, especially. These questions draw out differences among the different kinds of campus in terms of access, mission, and resource for disability services, especially strong differences among 2 and 4-year campuses, I'm finding. My final 2 sets of questions ask about their relations with faculty, including how they work around compliance issues with faculty, and their relations with students, including their perceptions of barriers students face and their perceptions of changes in students' attitudes or demographics over the time they've been working. One of the things I learned from these last 2 sets of questions is how faculty-student relations differ from campus to campus, as well as how different campuses have come to specialize in providing different kinds of access, or access for particular populations. There's really interesting demographic clumping that comes up in CUNY. In total, across both the interviews and the focus groups, I expect to collect approximately 25 hours of audio. At this point, I'm a bit more than halfway through my interview process and set to begin my focus groups this summer. I've spoken with 10 informants representing all 3 campus types and all 3 generational groupings. There are some folks central to the history who I haven't been able to get a hold of yet, but I'm still optimistic that I'll be able to make that happen. In the rest of my time today, I want to I want to give a quick taste of what is emerging from my interviews and how I'm deriving the topics for my focus groups. I'll close by discussing my archivization process and some quick impressions of where textual analysis fits into this study. The first informant I spoke with was Meryl, a first-generation service provider who began her work in 1978. Coming with a background in social work, she administered a grant-funded program at Queensborough Community College called the Homebound College Program, a distance learning program for people with severe mobility impairments. Since she began in the system before Section 504 came into effect, she witnessed the formalizing of Disability Service Director role and the formation of the Cross-Campus Disability Directors Collaborative, COSD, the Committee on Student Disability Issues, which engineered many of the programs over the last 4 decades. My subject was gave a particularly strong response to my question about whether she identifies as an activist and how that perspective comes out in her work. She identified strongly as an activist, noting that she'd been involved in the independent living movement in Queens for many decades. In explaining how she sees her work as activist, she told stories about efforts she and other COSD members had made to lobby state legislature to secure a stable funding line for disability services in the CUNY during the 1980s, which to that point had only been funded through temporary grants on local campuses. She described the way she and her first-generation colleagues helped form student disability activist groups, which could agitate for change on campuses in ways service directors couldn't. For example, when the group So Fed Up, the Student Organization for Every Disability United for Progress, a group at Brooklyn College, filed a civil rights lawsuit over inaccessible buildings. When Merrill claimed the title as activist, she spoke of direct action work to change policies both inside and outside the university, and she spoke about the importance of activist techniques, including public organizing and deft use of legislative bureaucracy to enforce change. Merrill's perspective contrasts strongly with many of the second and third generation service providers I've interviewed. One second generation informant who had a personal background in student disability activism, but later became a CUNY central office administrator argued that disability service directors have too great an obligation to the university system as a whole to effectively work as activists. While one aspect of the job involves advocating for the student, he argued that the ultimate obligation of the office is to maintain the high academic standards of the institution, that this balancing act is key to maintaining support from the broader administration for disability services programs. I discuss this at greater length in the blog version of this, which you'll find linked here. What I'm trying to show here is the way my exploratory interview process is helping me develop the focal points for my eventual focus groups. Activism, or the provider's beliefs about how activism works in relation to disability services, is emerging as a powerful problematic for this population, an issue that divides their perspectives, sometimes along generational lines, but perhaps according to other factors that I'll discover in the focus groups themselves. Other key themes are emerging as possible topics for further analysis across generation and campus affiliation. For example, the role of technology for disability services is obviously key to most of their narratives. Likewise, I'm finding interesting divided opinions on issues related to academic standards and testing, which is obviously a contentious issue given CUNY's history of open admissions and the legacy of high-stakes gatekeeping literacy tests that come with it. Before I close, I'd like to briefly outline how I'm using archival research and textual analysis in this study. Since the history of disability programming in CUNY is so scattered and so poorly recorded in authorized archives, much of my materials are coming from the service providers themselves. Many of the first generation have maintained small private collections of documents from their work, and they've been generous enough to give them to me for my study. I should say here that one key reason why this study is working at all is that the CUNY disability service community is actively interested in getting this history documented before it's forgotten. Like my focus group methodology, the archive process tends to feed back through the initial interviews. In every interview I do, I learn about 2 or 3 now defunct CUNY programs I wasn't aware existed, which I can then follow up on, both with my informants and by referencing local campus archives if there's any data that exists there. Based on what I've found so far, I'm in the process of developing a taxonomy of the kinds of texts these service providers have produced as part of their role. In one sense, these documents help me reconstruct the details of the history overall, but they also help me understand the ways service providers use rhetoric to achieve their ends. Especially interesting to me is how they justify the value of their services to different stakeholders and the ways they leverage established beliefs about disability to get their way. In my taxonomy, I try to group together different rhetorical situations wherein service providers claim authority to talk about disability. The first group is performative institutional discourse. Here I mean things like grant proposals, programmatic assessments, funding requests, and other texts that show service providers using rhetoric to work within bureaucratic systems. These are the most common texts I have access to, often because they're kept as matters of public record. Second is dialogic administrative discourse. These are things like correspondence between service providers on different campuses, minutes from COSD meetings, that's the collective that I talked about earlier, conference proceedings, other texts that show service providers in dialogue, sharing practices, and debating ideas about disability and access among themselves. Third is informal or informational public discourse. These are materials the service provider produces to provide information about disability and services to the public, to students, to faculty, or to parents. This is by far the most prolific kind of discourse, but it also tends to be ephemeral and not well archived. Examples are pamphlets, flyers, websites, things like that. Finally, what I'm calling performative pedagogical discourse. This category attests to the fact that many service providers have developed unique curricular programs on their campuses. A compelling example I'm trying to find more evidence about at the moment is a program developed by a learning disability specialist at another community college, which ran a 2-semester credit-bearing course in academic skills and self-advocacy training for high-risk students with disabilities in their first year. The program is now defunct, but I'm curious to see how its approach to literacy instruction and disability advocacy might align with work in our own field toward creating disability studies inspired writing courses. It's too early to tell what kinds of questions I'll be able to ask from these texts once I've got them. One key question pertains to the ways disability programming is justified, as I said. When speaking to different populations in different political climates, how likely are service providers to invoke the legal mandate for access, as opposed to invoking a value-added justification for disability inclusion? How likely are they to invoke rhetoric of diversity as a positive value? Likewise, I'm deeply interested in how questions of academic standards are policed in these documents. I'll end there today. I would love to talk more with you after the panel or in the comments on this post if anyone has ideas or questions about my project. I look forward to reporting more as things continue to develop.